Hey everyone, it's Jason Pannone, Head of Reference and Cultural Assets Manager here at the East Hartford Public Library. Today I'm going to switch gears a little bit and I'm going to talk to you about some book recommendations, specifically in the science fiction genre. It's a genre I happen to like a lot. I've read some classic stuff, and over the last few years I've read some really neat contemporary science fiction. I took a webinar last week on science fiction overall, and I learned of a couple more books that I'm really interested in reading. I've ordered them, and I'm going to talk about them at the end of this video. But right now I'm going to share with you just a few recommendations of stuff that I've read in recent years that I think you might enjoy a lot. Just as a preamble, I am not being compensated in any way, shape, or form by the authors, publishers, etc. They're not paying me to do this. I am doing this completely on my own. Also, some of these books are recommended as YA books, but you know your kid better than we do, so be sure to take a look at these books. I'm going to post the titles and authors and publishers underneath the video when I'm done so that you have them for reference. Just be sure, read them ahead of time to see if they are appropriate for your child. Because sometimes what's appropriate for one kid isn't for another, and you know your kid best. So with that, I am going to start off with a really neat series that I read a few years ago. It's in the alternative history subgenre of science fiction, and it's called the Leviathan series. It's by the author Scott Westerfeld. There's 3 books within the trilogy: Leviathan, Goliath, and Behemoth. And it's a really neat world in which Charles Darwin figures out genetic engineering in the 1850s and 1860s, and the world has evolved into basically 2 camps where the British and the French, the Japanese have all evolved to basically function with genetically modified and genetically altered animals and biotechnology. On the other hand, you have countries like Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where they're much more on steampunk. They used mechanized battle machines. They used all sorts of what we would call steampunk technology. And the setting of this is right during, it's the start and through much of what in our universe is the First World War. It's really neat. It's kind of a different take in seeing that, what would have happened if this genetic engineering had been discovered, and how would societies adjust to it? Would there be this sort of competing blocks of power between people who use biotechnology and those who don't? And then countries like the United States, which in this world use a mixture of both. They're not exclusively biotech or steampunk technology. Really cool series. I really enjoyed it. I gave it to my nephew. He loved it. So there you go. You may want to check it out. The second one is William Gibson's The Difference Engine. This is considered basically one of the granddaddies of the steampunk genre. And if you don't know what steampunk is, basically imagine Victorian times where everything runs on steam. There's no electricity. The joke is that one of the tropes is that everybody flies around on dirigibles. It's kind of a joke. I mean, take it for what it's worth. But it's a really kind of cool, it's also an alternative history, but it basically looks at what would have happened if Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace had gotten a working computer built in the 1840s and the 1850s in a world where the British monarchy is abolished, where Lord Byron survives and he's now the prime minister, and the world is very different, and it all runs on Steam and computer punch cards. And it's really neat because at the end, these computers all become sentient. And it's just such a wild take and an alternative look. I thought it was really neat, the alternative history, and just kind of the what if. Worth checking out, and especially because it is kind of a granddaddy of the steampunk genre if you're into that. The third one is a very recent dystopian YA novel, trilogy actually, called Arc of the Scythe. It's by Neal Shusterman. There's 3 books in that: Scythe, Thunderhead, and The Toll. The Toll just came out. It's a really weird dystopia in that it, in theory, should be a utopia. It's a world where natural death no longer exists through biotechnology and other things. People don't die anymore. You can be reversed age, so even if you get to be elderly, you can be reset back to 20 and live your life all over again. But without death, there's really no motivation for anyone. It becomes this world of boredom. Nobody has motivation to create because there's no death to work against, or disease to conquer, or poverty. Everything is controlled by the Thunderhead, which is sort of a sentient version of the cloud, which I thought was really neat. Dystopia, a utopia that's a dystopia. And the Scythe refers to the people who are charged by the Thunderhead with gleaning, which means that the population, to prevent population explosion, overpopulation, every so often people have to be actually killed, and only the Scythes can do that. And the whole thing becomes a battle where there is one psychopathic Scythe who tries to take over the world, and these other two who are trying to stop him. So really cool, very fast-paced, very well written. I thought it was super neat. I have not read The Toll yet. Now is probably not the time to be reading Dystopian, so I kind of want to, but I do want to finish it because I do want to find out what happens at the end of the trilogy. The next group is going to be two books that fall under this sort of new subgenre called climate science fiction, or Sci-Fi. The first one I read several years ago, it's called The Windup Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Really neat thing about the impact of climate change. It's a world where genetic engineering and genetic modification has gone crazy. There's been economic collapse. The world has kind of gone to hell in a handbasket. And what corporations do survive peddle these genetically modified seeds that you can sow them only so many times, and then they stop, and then you have to buy more seeds from the company. So basically the entire world is enthralled, more or less enthralled, to these companies. However, there are places like Thailand that have closed their borders, and most of the plot of this, one of the main plots of the story, falls around a corporate spy who's trying to go to Thailand to find these plants that have been extinct for years in the rest of the world, like tomatoes and eggplants, to try to capitalize on them for his own ends. The secondary plot is around the Windup Girl, the title. They're new people. They're sort of androids. They're synthetic life. And they basically are built and created to be slaves and pleasure toys for the wealthy. They're viewed with suspicion. They're called Hiki-Piki girls because their motions are they're so lifelike that the programmers had to make their motions look very jerky in order for people to tell them apart. And that's an interesting subplot there. I thought it was really neat, regardless of what your views are on climate change. It's worth looking at. I think there's some interesting topics that are discussed there really well. The second one is Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140. And it imagines a world where the sea level has risen so high that Manhattan Island in New York City is partly submerged. So what were now streets, Times Square is now underwater. Many of the streets are now canals, and the skyscrapers are effectively their own little islands, people living in these giant blocks, islands that are more or less isolated from each other except for boats and gondolas and things like that. New York being New York, it has rebounded, although climate continues to be an issue, and it's kind of an interesting take. And again, whatever your views on climate change, read it, because it really is an interesting look at social isolation and kind of how the world is interconnected. And while this all sounds super, super depressing, I do want to end with the last recommendation of the things that I've read with John Scalzi's Redshirts. This book is hilarious. If you have watched the original series Star Trek and you know about the Redshirts and the fact that most of them never made it past the first commercial break, you will really, really enjoy this novel. It's hilarious. It's a fast read. There's so many little inside jokes for Star Trek fans, especially those of the original series, that you will probably end up laughing the whole way through it. Really, really liked it. So I'm going to move on to two final books. that really caught my attention from the webinar. One I caught my attention from the webinar last week, and the other one I thought, what the heck, I'll try it. So the first one is called The Deep. It's written by River Solomon, David Diggs, William Houston, and Jonathan Snipes. It's part of a subgenre that's really, really recent, only several years old, called Afrofuturism. The novel was inspired by a rap song produced by the group Clipping for an episode of NPR's This American Life, and that episode was titled We Are the Future. So I'm going to provide a link to the music at the end, because it gives the overview of basically the formulation of this book. So the premise of the book is that there were pregnant African women being brought aboard the Middle Passage during the years of slavery, and often these women would be thrown overboard. But what happens is that their babies are born, and they live underwater, and they've evolved to become these water-breathing humanoids, and they've created this peaceful society, but they block out all memory of the sufferings and all the rest of that, except for one person who's the historian, and this person is the communal memory of the people. So I don't want to give any way more of that. If you want, you can go online and find reviews. It sounds really, really interesting premise. It was an NPR Book of the Year last year. It's just come out, I think in November of 2019. So I've got that on an order, and hopefully I'll get it soon, and I'm really looking forward to taking a read. And the last one is also by John Scalzi. Like I said, I really enjoyed Redshirts. I thought I'd give it another one of his books a try, because I think his premises are really interesting. The premise of this book is that in the future, we all get into space, we're all exploring space, but we find out that there are actually very few habitable planets out there, and moreover, there's lots of other aliens out there, and they want the same planets, and they are willing to fight us for them. So rather than enlisting young people, the Earth authorities recruit retirees, because they figure, well, they've got all these valuable life skills and experience, so once you reach retirement age, you can enlist, you can join the Space Force, and if you survive after a 2-year hitch, you get prime real estate off-world, and you can get your own land. So I thought it's a neat premise, the fact that age is valued over youth in terms of space exploration. Usually the space jockeys are, young 20 and 30-somethings, and the oldies are all the admirals sitting back at fleet headquarters. So I'm kind of intrigued to see it, especially after my experience with Scalzi before. So that's some recommendations for you. If you've got others, let me know. I'd be happy to take a look at them. And like I said, I'm going to put a link to the music and to all the books down there in the bottom in the comments underneath. So hope you enjoy that. As always, wash your hands often, practice safe social distancing, and be well. We'll talk to you later. Bye.